Good morning or afternoon or whenever it is that you're watching this video. The intent really is just for the 3 lower 6th A-level classes, just me going through some of the questions, giving you some feedback on where there were some common mistakes and hopefully how you can improve your answers going forward. I will also share with you the mark scheme for this paper, so that you can go through the mark scheme as well as listening to me. We'll see how it goes. So the first paper that I want to go through is the micro paper. By the way, let me make a general comment, being that actually I was quite impressed with the level of work that most of you submitted, and for saying that you've had such a rough ride over the last 3 or 4 weeks. I actually thought that your effort and the amount of knowledge that you've retained from the last 2 terms was actually quite impressive. So well done. Right, let's go through this micro paper then. 1A, which of the following might cause the demand curve for watermelons to shift to the right? The answer is D. A lot of you put A. I assume you put A because you saw the words bumper harvest, thought about the supply curve shifting to the right. But a bumper harvest, remember, would affect the supply curve and not the demand curve. So the answer is not A for this question, because the question is about the demand curve. B, it's not that, because a fall in the price of the other fruit would actually mean that this demand curve for watermelons shifted inwards, and a decrease in the price of a watermelon, remember, moves you along the demand curve rather than shifting the demand curve. So the answer is A, okay, a change in taste towards healthy eating. The next question then about the PPF, some very good answers here. All I would say is if the question is asking you about the price mechanism, then you really ought to be talking about some of the functions of the price mechanism, whether that is rationing, signaling, or incentives. I'd have thought that in this case, you could have talked about the fact that if the demand for watermelons rises, that pushes the price of watermelons up. That sends a signal or acts as an incentive for producers to reallocate their resources towards making more melons. All right, I'm not going to go through the diagram here because most of you got it right. 2A, the only reason people got this wrong is that they got the formula the wrong way around. So when you're doing any elasticity formula, remember that Q always goes on the top. It's always the percentage change in the quantity, whether that's the percentage change in the quantity demanded or the percentage change in the quantity in supply in this case, divided by the percentage change in price. If it's income, then it should be Y. If it's cross price elasticity, it should rather be the price of B. So that's the formula. It comes out as 0.4. It's not negative 0.4 because supply curves are upward sloping. It's positive. So the answer is 0.4, which makes it inelastic. 2B. Some people in 2B talk to me about the price elasticity of demand for tinned tomatoes rather than fresh tomatoes. But it's not about price elasticity of demand. It's about price elasticity of supply. It's also no good just to define what PES is and just leave it at that. The question asks you, why is it different? So you have to give me a reason. Well, there are a couple of reasons. For one, tinned tomatoes can be stored and fresh tomatoes cannot. They're perishable. So therefore, when the price rises, producers will find it more easy to flood the market with tinned tomatoes because they just have to open the warehouse, rather than growing fresh tomatoes, which they can't because fresh tomatoes can only be picked when they're ripe. And they can't be stored in a warehouse. Another way you could have gone, you don't need both, but another way that you could have gone is just to talk about the time frame in which both of these products can be produced. Tinned tomatoes presumably don't take very much time at all. You just kind of push all the ingredients into the can. You've made a can. Fresh tomatoes, on the other hand, will take ages to it might take 3 or 4 months to actually grow on the vine before you can pick them. So again, even if the price changes tomorrow, we can't respond quickly to those price changes because it will take time to grow the fresh tomatoes. So those are your answers there. Statement C, sorry, question 2C. The answer is C here. Both statements are correct. So this is actually now talking about demand rather than supply. There's a bit of a shift of gears there, which was, intentional. It's playing on your understanding of the law of diminishing marginal utility. As we consume more goods, the marginal utility decreases. So as we consume more Jaffa cakes, each additional one is more gives us less utility than the one before. That's statement B. But actually our total happiness is increasing all the time. So even if my first Jaffa cake, I don't know, gives me 5 units of utility, my second one gives me 4, my third one gives me 3, and my fourth one gives me 2, all the while my total happiness is actually increasing. So statement A is correct, but my marginal utility is decreasing all the way through. So statement B is correct as well. So C is the correct answer there. Both statements are correct. Then we're going on to taxes on e-cigarettes. The diagram. So the diagram, right. Very, very few people got the diagram 100% correct. I'm just trying to angle my whiteboard so that there is not so much glare. That's not very helpful as well. Okay, this is a percentage tax or an ad valorem tax, okay, which means that you can't just do a parallel shift, all right? It has to be a pivot shift like that, all right? The supply curves are becoming divergent. That's because it's a percentage of the marginal cost. It's a percentage of the selling price that the seller was willing to accept. So if the seller was willing to accept this, you add on a percentage. A percentage of a small number is very little. A percentage of a high number is a lot. So as a percentage, the difference between the two gradients is getting bigger. All you really needed to do then was just talk about how the fact with indirect taxes, not all of the tax burden is shifted onto consumers, only part of it. Okay, so if that's 92%, where you can see that, you know, P3, if we called it P3, is not the same as P2. That's the 92% all being passed on. It hasn't all been passed on to consumers, only part of it. The amount of tax that is passed on to consumers will depend on elasticity. So the more inelastic your demand curve, the more the burden will be passed on. And it's only if the demand curve is completely inelastic or perfectly inelastic that actually all of the burden would be passed on. Only in that particular anomalous case. Okay. So with a 5-mark question like that, when it says using a diagram, traditionally 2 marks would be given for a good diagram and 3 marks for the explanation that go along with it. Question B then, with reference to the data, examine whether tobacco should be considered an inferior good. 1 or 2 of you got confused with inferior goods and other things, which unfortunately is going to kind of wipe you out for this question. You need to, part of this question is to identify what an inferior good actually is. An inferior good is one in which as incomes go up, the quantity demanded actually falls. And it's tobacco as well. Some of you were talking about e-cigarettes rather than tobacco. I didn't penalize that so much, but just be aware it was about tobacco rather than inferior goods. So there was some data there. It's always good to use the data. You can never achieve full marks in a data question unless you're referring to the extracts. I gave you some data saying, you know, there were some rich states in America that didn't have very much tobacco consumption, like Vermont. There were some low-income states like Mississippi and Louisiana, which had a very high rate of smokers. So you could use that data. But on the other hand, as an evaluation, you could say that I only gave you selected states and I didn't give you all states. I also didn't give you time series data. I just gave you a snapshot of one particular date. There's lots of kind of different paths you can go down. All I would say with this is just make sure that your structure is correct. All right, the structure for all questions like this should be point 1, evaluation 1, point 2, evaluation 2. No need for a conclusion. And your evaluations should really be evaluating your analysis. This shouldn't be a kind of complete counter argument which has no context. Your evaluation should be sizing the point of analysis that you originally made. So the example I just used works quite well. So the data shows us that there are some rich states which have not a lot of tobacco consumers, but there are some poor states which have lots of tobacco consumers. The implication is that therefore that's an inferior good. There you've got analysis and you've got application. On the other hand, the data only shows us selected states, and in fact, the situation may be different once I've given you data for all 50 states. That would be an evaluation of that point. What else could you have said? You could have talked about the fact that, I don't know, I haven't read the data for quite a while. Well, off the top of my head, you could talk about the fact that actually tobacco has no relationship with income, that actually it has, it just depends on how many people are addicted or not. You could have talked about the fact that now that e-cigarettes are cheaper than tobacco, and therefore more people are consuming e-cigarettes than tobacco, actually does imply that tobacco is an inferior good, because as incomes are going down, people are going to be more price sensitive to changes. Have a look at the mark scheme there, and have a look at the different things that you might have mentioned. Going on to C, discuss the view that young consumers of e-cigarettes are behaving irrationally. So just as a reminder, what does rational mean? Rational for consumers would mean that they're trying to maximize utility, or that they think that they are consuming because the benefits outweigh the costs. This was just a question testing whether or not you'd revised anything to do with irrationality. So your spec offers you, I think, 3 or 4 good examples of irrationality when people follow herding behavior. That's very relevant with e-cigarettes. Peer pressure. Are people just looking at what their friends are doing? Are people addicted? Are they unable to make rational decisions because of their addiction? Are people, or similarly, are people making rational decisions, albeit based on false information? So you can be rational, but also basing your rational decision on false information. So you didn't know, you hadn't been given the information about the potential negative effects of e-cigarettes, and therefore you were making a rational decision, but based on incorrect info. The structure then for a 12-mark question is exactly the same, but in an 8-mark question, it's kind of 3, 1, and then the same for this one. Sorry, for a 12-mark question, that changes, and it is, what is it? It's 8 and 4, so it's 4 and 2. So essentially, you need to be writing probably another 2 chains of analysis for each of your analysis sections, for each of your points. You need to be doubling the amount that you write for your evaluation. And if I had a general comment about people's exam papers, was that some people are not writing enough for their evaluations. The evaluation shouldn't really just be a throwaway sentence at the end. Oh, there's a time lag. It depends on, the marginal propensity to consume. Actually go through your analysis here and pull it apart. Tell me, what are the assumptions that you've made? Why might this not be true in certain circumstances? That's what we mean by evaluation. Okay, but really your evaluation should be not a dissimilar length to your original analysis. With the final question then about healthcare, lots of different strands that you could have taken here, but I think the best ones that you could have gone for is identifying healthcare as a positive externality and giving me the positive externality diagram. After all, that is the main criticism of free market provision of healthcare, that it leads to a market failure. It leads to overconsumption, underconsumption of healthcare, and therefore the state needs to intervene to provide it. A second obvious route to go down is the idea of income inequality, that if you have a free market provision, then actually it's only rich people that can afford to consume healthcare and poor people cannot, and therefore their quality of their healthcare that they receive is much lower. Okay, so there's a couple of different routes that you could go down. The structure for a 15-mark question then is exactly the same. There is no need for a conclusion. Your chains of analysis for the analysis section just need to be a lot bigger, and your evaluation sections in particular need to be a lot bigger as well. Okay, Right, moving on then to the macro paper. So question 1. Almost everybody got question 1A incorrect. Which of the following is an example of a direct tax on wealth? So this was a question by me to test whether you had understood the difference between income and wealth, which clearly a lot of you don't. Income is a flow concept. Income is the reward or the compensation received for use of factors of production. So labor, wages, capital, interest, land, rent, entrepreneurship, profits / dividends. Okay, income is those things: wages, rents, interest, dividends. Okay, that's all income. Wealth, however, it's a stock concept. It's the value of our assets. If I'm directly taxing wealth, I'm taxing the value of your assets. I'm not taxing your income. So C is wrong because C is a tax on income. It is a direct tax. It fulfills that part of the criteria, but it's not a tax on wealth. Inheritance tax then is, all right? Inheritance tax is a direct tax on wealth. You can't avoid it. You can't pass it on. So it's a direct tax, and it's a tax on your value of your assets. That is the direct tax on wealth. It's not stamp duty. Stamp duty is an indirect tax on buying a house. You could argue that it's a tax on wealth, but it's indirect, not direct. Luxury goods is again a tax on sales, but it's an indirect tax as well. B, right, some of you need to do some really decent revision now on quantitative easing. I'm going to quickly run through it. All right, it's not enough just to say it's printing money. It's not enough to say it's increasing the money supply. It's not enough to give the formula MV equals PT. Okay, you need to talk about central banks. So in the case of the UK, it would be the Bank of England. Prints money. It literally doesn't print money. In fact, it literally creates electronic money. Okay, so the Bank of England creates money. You could talk about increasing the money supply here, but what does it do with it? All right, it buys second-hand, all right, and this is all key info. It buys second-hand government bonds. In this latest round of QE, they are actually buying corporate bonds as well, but we can discuss that perhaps at a different time. They're buying second-hand government bonds, which means they're not giving the government the money. They're giving the money to people who had the bonds, who bought the bonds before. So that's normally people like me, okay? It could be firms or it could be banks. So we were all previously bond holders. The Bank of England now is giving us money in exchange for those bonds. So the cash is going this way and the bonds are going that way. That means that the Bank of England now is the main bond holder for most of government debt. On the other hand, we've got lots of cash. Now, what was the whole point of that? You'll notice, I hope, that nobody got richer in this. People just changed the composition of their money. Instead of having the value wrapped up in a bond, which is very illiquid, they now have cash, which is very liquid, i.e. they can spend it. So if you have cash, you can go out and spend it. People can consume it. Firms can use it for investment, and banks can lend out money. If you've got a bank stuffed full of cash, banks hate having cash. Okay, they can't make money from cash. So what they want to do is they want to lend it, and they want to lend it cheaply to people, and they want to lend it cheaply to firms, which means they will bring interest rates down. Okay, and people again can use it on their credit cards, and firms can use it for investment purposes. If consumption and investment go up, then AD goes up. So there's a lot of key points there. Central bank prints money, increases the money supply, and then buys second-hand bonds from bond holders. This increases the liquidity of money in the economy, and therefore this should stimulate aggregate demand. Those are your 4 points. All right, so that's what I wanted. If any of those points were missing, obviously I deducted a point from your answer. Just bear with me. I think I've... Okay, 2A, why would a government find this useful? it's a fairly vague answer to just say they'll find it useful so they can decide what to do with fiscal policy. Fine, but give me a specific example. Well, for one, you might want to talk about the redistribution of income, that actually you might come up with a tax policy that reduces taxes for low-income households rather than high-income households, because you know that low-income households will actually spend the money. 2B, again, it's not enough just to tell me that low-income households spend less than high-income households. The question says, say why. Well, it's generally because low-income households find it difficult to satisfy their wants and needs. Or sorry, I'll say that the different way around. High-income households find it easy to satisfy their wants and needs and have surplus income left over, so that actually they can save some of their income. Low-income households, on the other hand, are struggling to satisfy all their wants and needs, and they will spend probably most of their income doing so. And so they have very little left over for saving. I want all of that as the explanation. C then, most of you managed to work that out. The answer is C. The way you would do that is you would do 1 minus MPC, and that would give you MPW. So MPW equals 0.4. Then you divide 0.4 by 8, and then you do it according to those ratios. So to find NPM, you times it by 3 and you get 0.15. If you didn't quite follow that, then just ask me about it and I can go through it with you at a different point. 3A was generally answered very well. Just make sure that you're being very specific with the time periods. Don't just say, around about 2014, there was disinflation. No, just give me the actual figures from the graph, okay? I think examiners want you to be specific, because I can get my 8-year-old daughter to say the line's gone up and down, all right? But you need to show a little bit more sophistication than that. So actually use the numbers reading off from the graph. Right, the examiner view that measuring inflation is not an exact science. Okay, this was really just my way of testing. Do you remember how inflation is measured? There was lots of good chat about weighting goods and services in a basket. What does the basket meant to represent? It's the average household spending. There were some good evaluations about, well, they're only changing the basket once out of every 5 years. Does it really take into account any possible changes in quality? All I would say with all of this, again, is just make sure that you are talking about Singapore in all of this. The question is, the inflation rate in Singapore was, there's a direct steer there to says, make it about the data. And where this came out is a lot of people were saying, well, CPI doesn't measure housing. That's wrong. I mean, in the UK, it doesn't measure housing, but if you look at the extract, it does say that the inflation, that CPI in Singapore does measure housing. So that's a key instance there where people just weren't reading the data and giving me very generic answers rather than specific answers. Going on to C then, discuss the view that deflation could be more damaging to the economy of Singapore than high levels of inflation. Again, some people offering a very generic answer here and not really talking about Singapore. Deflation is more damaging to economies than high levels of inflation. The reason being that people hold on to their money, and if people hold on to the money, then aggregate demand falls, and that brings people into a recession. If the price level of things are going down, obviously firms will struggle to make profit, because if the thing that you're selling is worth less than the things that you bought to make it, okay, because deflation happens over time. So you buy a load of raw materials in, and then you make the thing. It takes you a couple of months to make it. By the time you sell it, your price level has gone down. Profits, there's less profit. Firms make less profits. There's less money for investment. Firms close down. That creates unemployment. I mean, I've given you lots of chains of analysis that you could have gone down there. But on the other hand, is it as bad as high levels of inflation? So you could have told me about all the problems with inflation. But as evaluations, you could also have brought into this idea of Singapore. Well, deflation is not so bad for Singapore because, yeah, a lot of you point out Singapore is an export-driven economy. So if prices are going down, that means exports are much more competitive than they previously were. So that might actually work in Singapore's favor. Different ideas. Just make sure you're sticking to this structure again. Point 1, evaluation 1. Point 2, evaluation 2. No need for a conclusion. And then 3D, World happiness. And again, this was just my way of testing you. Did you revise anything about happiness, or have you totally kind of glossed over that in your revision? And some of you clearly have. Others of you, on the other hand, have a very good understanding of happiness. There isn't a right answer to this, all right? It's just whether you can say anything sensible. Can you make links between this idea of GDP and world happiness? World happiness is, a very contested concept. But I did give you quite a lot of steers in the data by saying the UN measures it in a particular way. So it's really up for you to decide now. Do you think that a large change in GDP, as we're experiencing at the moment in 2020, is this likely to have a very big effect on Singapore's world ranking happiness world ranking? So the fact that people have got less income, it probably means there will be less tax revenue for the government, and the government can therefore spend less money on things like healthcare or social security and the things that make people happy. Because if you go back to the data on what they're measuring for happiness, it's all there. The people that didn't do so well on this answer just stuck to the kind of the quantitative aspect. Well, Singapore's got quite a lot of money. They're only 30th in the world ranking. There are some countries that have less money and higher in the ranking, and there are some other countries that are probably a bit richer but don't have a lower ranking. And just because Singapore goes down in GDP doesn't necessarily mean that they'll go up or it goes down. And that's fine to a degree, but what it clearly shows is that you don't want to engage in the qualitative aspect of what happiness actually means. And that's the more interesting thing. And it's really what the examiner's more interested in as well. Do you understand that happiness is more than just income? Income might influence happiness, but it's certainly not the be-all and end-all of happiness. Happiness is a much more multi-dimensional way of measuring kind of standards of living. So what I'm going to do, in case you're still not quite happy with that, is I'm going to also attach a little excerpt produced by Edexcel on happiness, which you can read in your own time. And again, it just shows, what it should illustrate is some of the links between income and happiness, just so that you've got now something to revise from when you do this topic. It's a topic that a lot of teachers and a lot of schools will probably gloss over very quickly. It is an issue we'll come back to in development economics, but it does get tested. So we need to do it, and we need to make sure that we're comfortable answering questions with it. Okay, I hope that was useful. As I say, you've got the mark scheme. You're going to have that extra attachment on global happiness, and hopefully you pick something out from this session. All right, cheers, bye.